In the tradition of Larry making you work for your living, I said, what's the topic for tonight? You know, I mean, I do lots of speeches, as many of you know, and I thought, you know, I can do almost any general thing. He said, well, the topic is what to do about the Justice Department. Well, in order to be able to be competent about that, literally on the way here, I was talking with former Attorney General Ed Meese, getting his advice so I would sound semi-smart. But before I get to that, during the reception, so many of you came up to me and said that you were concerned, that you were worried, that you needed some sense of optimism, and you felt that normally when I was on TV, I was optimistic, and that encouraged you. So I wanted to share with you probably the greatest single lesson I learned about optimism. It was 1981. I was a sophomore congressman. Ronald Wilson Reagan had just won an election in which he had the highest electoral vote victory over an incumbent president in American history. We were all in awe, and a number of us were invited down to the White House to get to know him better. So there we are, drinking coffee out of the White House china, and he comes in, about 90 of us. He comes in, and he says, look, I really want you to understand me. We're all, of course, leaning forward, expecting some highly sophisticated explanation. He says, you know, there were these parents, and they had twins. And the one twin was permanently optimistic, no matter what happened. And the other twin was permanently pessimistic, no matter what happened. And the parents felt really concerned. How do we get them to come to grips with reality? So they came up with a strategy for Christmas. The pessimist would get a room filled with the finest toys that were available. The optimist would get a room filled with horse manure. They sent them to their two rooms, and they waited 1 hour. They walked into the pessimist. He's sitting in the middle of this great collection of toys, and he's crying. And they said, what are you doing? And he said, well, that toy is going to break, and that toy's battery is going to run out, and that toy is going to be stolen. And he went around the room and explained every toy in a negative way. They looked at each other and, what do we do now? They walked out. They go to the next room. Now remember, this is the room filled with horse manure. This is Ronald Reagan telling the story. And the little kid in the room is running back and forth, throwing horse manure in the air, yelling, wee, wee. And they said, what are you doing? He said, I'm looking for the pony. Reagan looked out at us and he said, guys, I just want to understand. I'm the guy who's always looking for the pony. So if you wonder why I'm an optimist, it's because I am a Ronald Reagan Republican, and I'm looking for the pony. Now, the question which Hillsdale College asked me to talk about, what to do about the Justice Department, is actually part of a much bigger question. How do we decisively take power from a deeply entrenched radical elite that controls the commanding heights, to use Lenin's term? Scott Rasmussen, who I recommend highly if you haven't looked at it, has done a brilliant study. He figured out that there's a 1% of the elite, Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera, and he has three things. You have to graduate from those schools with a graduate degree, not just go to school, graduate degree, earn $150,000 or more as a family, and live in a big city. And if you're in that group, you are so radically different from the rest of us that it's astounding. In fact, Scott makes the point that, for example, when asked the question, would you be willing to steal an election rather than lose it? 7% of the American people say yes. 67% of the elites say yes, which he said in his entire career of polling, is the most frightening single figure he ever saw. And when you go through all of their values, they are so far to the left of the rest of us and so willing to use their power to impose it. Remember, these are the people who run the government, the people who run the news media, the people who run the universities, and increasingly, the people who run the largest corporations. It was captured beyond Rasmussen by Charles Murray in a remarkable book called Coming Apart, in which Murray simply went and looked at zip codes and reported that if you went to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera, you married people who went to Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera. You lived in a zip code with people who are from Harvard, Princeton, Yale, et cetera. During the period of the rise of Trump, I kept saying to the elite reporters, none of you get it, because The Apprentice, which was a very successful show for 13 years, was not on PBS right after Downton Abbey. And therefore, no one in your social circle ever saw it, and you had no idea how Trump would be effective on television. But this is who they are. These are the people who want to run the rest of us, and it's very clear, both in the Rasmussen study and in Charles Murray's book. These people believe they are our superiors, that it is their duty and their moral right to dictate to the rest of us. And let me say in that context, one of the reasons I was thrilled to be here tonight, in Star Wars, the Galactic Empire is trying to establish totalitarian control over the entire universe. And there is a resistance. And ultimately, of course, as you know, the resistance wins. Well, I have to tell you, when I'm here tonight with Larry Arnn and the rest of you, I feel like I'm at the heart of the resistance, and I am confident we will win. However, real victory is not one election. Anthony Jay was a senior advisor to Margaret Thatcher. And based on the things that they encountered in the government, he created a brilliant series, which I recommend to all of you, which became a series of books and TV shows called Yes, Minister and Yes, Prime Minister. It is the best study of the depth of the civil service undermining, blocking, diverting the elected officials ever written. And it's true. I was struck by Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense, said to me one day, the attitude in the Pentagon is that the presidential appointees are the summer help. And all they have to do is wait. And the summer help leaves. I was reminded when I was a freshman, I was pro-defense, and back in 1979 under Jimmy Carter, if you were pro-defense, the Defense Department loved you. So the CNO, Chief of Naval Operations, invited me over one afternoon for coffee, or maybe I invited myself, but he said yes. And we're chatting, and he says to me, you realize that Jimmy Carter wanted to turn the U.S. Navy into an ambulance service for the North Atlantic. And on behalf of a 200-year tradition, I, by God, blocked him. And I remember, I happened to agree with him on the policy, but I remember standing there thinking, let me get this straight. The Chief of Naval Operations just told me that he deliberately blocked the commander-in-chief who had been elected by the American people. And I think that is, at its core, the attitude of the entire federal bureaucracy. Mike Pompeo said to me one day that one of his top staff people said to him, "You realize, boss, that there are about 25 of us and 27,000 of them in the State Department, and it's kind of like Fort Apache, the Bronx. We're just trying to hold on." Lincoln, to give you a sense of scale, Abraham Lincoln comes into office, replaces 3/4 of the federal employees. 3/4. Every postmaster, every customs officer, and puts into those places people loyal to him. It's probably the key to how he sustains the Union through 4 years of bitter, painful civil war. Today, because of the growth of the civil service system, the civil service is permanent. And unless we're prepared to go into office and fundamentally change that fact and return the government to the people, we don't currently have government of the people, by the people, and for the people, to quote Lincoln. We have government of the elites, by the elites, and for the elites. And the rest of us are allowed to complain. Now, if you want to change that, you have to be prepared for very dramatic and very deep changes. And that means that if the election of 24 works out, you're going to have conflict in 25, 26, 27, 28, and maybe another 8 or 10 years. Remember, this system began to grow up under Franklin Delano Roosevelt 89 years ago. So this thing has been growing for almost 9 decades. By the way, that's longer than Lincoln's described 7 in the Gettysburg Address. Now think about that. And what kind of folks are they? And it's not that they're evil, although a few of them have evil intent, but it is that they are totally, sincerely committed to the belief that you and I are stupid and that they have an obligation to govern us and to change us in ways that are appropriate. Now, to change that, I think, is an enormous problem. And I would just say to you that Lincoln understood, if you truly believe in government by the people, then you have to believe in government by the people. And the rise, starting with, in many ways, with Woodrow Wilson's works in the late 19th century. Wilson was an academic who was absolutely committed to the progressive idea that there are a small, select group of experts who should govern the country because they could do it so much smarter than the rest of us. A point which Scott Rasmussen told me, one of the most stunning conversations he had in doing his interviews was with a Harvard professor who said to him, why won't they just let us make the decisions? It's what we are trained to do. They have to understand the depth, the sincerity. These are not hypocritical people. These are totally sincere totalitarians who believe that if only you would relax, your life would become better because they are so much smarter and better trained than you are. Now, in that context, you also have to understand that government from Roosevelt on has attracted people to the bureaucracies who come in part because they believe they can make your life better if only you will get out of the way. And so they would like to dictate to you on virtually every aspect of your life, from whether or not you can have a gas stove, to whether or not your child actually should be transgender, to whether or not, in fact, you should learn that George Washington was a racist who kept slaves and therefore should not be studied. Just go down the list. And this has been growing. I've done a whole series at the American Spectator, starting in 1960, on the growth of where we have, how have we gotten this far off track? And the reason is that there is a core group of beliefs assimilated by more and more people, largely in the academy, and then transmitted through the news media, through politicians, through the bureaucracy, that are just insane. So if you go back and think about it, in the 1960s, the Department of Justice became a centerpiece for left-wing liberal lawyers who were going to break segregation in the South. Now, I happen to believe, as a guy born in Pennsylvania who grew up in an integrated U.S. Army and who experienced segregation as a young person when my dad was stationed in Georgia, I happen to believe ending segregation was morally and historically totally correct. On the other hand, those people who had decided how smart they were and how dumb we were then just shifted gears.